We move now to the last presentation of this first panel. It's going to be in charge of Isabel Argüelles Rozada. Isabel graduated in philosophy at the University of Oviedo in 2017 with a national prize for the best academic marks. Congratulations. She studied a master's in secondary teachers training, which allowed her to be a philosophy secondary teacher for a couple of years. Also, she studied a research master's in contemporary arts at the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya. And she's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oviedo here in Spain. Her doctoral thesis conducted a critical analysis of the figure of the flaneur. My pronunciation of French is awful. And the flaneur and its influence in contemporary philosophy, focusing on aesthetics. So, Isabel, whenever you want, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Josefa. Muchas gracias. Well, to everyone here, I don't know if you can see my screen right now.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Well, again, thank you very much. I will try to be short because I guess we are all hungry at this time of the day. Well, it's a real pleasure to meet you once again. Here I will talk about a kind of urban stroller, the flaneur, as you said, Josefa, who is a protagonist of many artistic narratives and who is affected by boredom, for sure. I will analyze how this character usually handles this emotion and the effects his or their idea of boredom has when it comes to the way this protagonist relates to the urban landscape and other inhabitants of it. Well, just to introduce the topic a little bit, the flaneur is a prototypical character in various narratives set in urban spaces, canonically defined as an idle wanderer of the great city that emerged following the population growth and infrastructural development of the 19th century. He has been frequently been portrayed as a melancholic genius artist, specifically through the notions of ennui and spleen, but this character is also very related to a specific boredom. Well, as we all know, we have analyzed it today many times. The concept of melancholy has undergone many historical variations, but nevertheless, there are certain recurring elements within the Western imaginary, from the ancient notion of an excess or imbalance, eucrasia of black bile in the spleen, through Augustine's Taedium, the Acedia experienced by medieval monks, and the German Baroque idea of Saturnism, and Todestrieb, studied by Walter Benjamin, to Charles Baudelaire's conceptualization of ennui. The contemplative, solitary, and genius-like man has consistently been one of the defining traits, I would say, of the melancholic or Saturnine type. And this idea is later inherited by the figure of the flaneur. However, considerably less attention has been given to his relationship with boredom, as I said before, despite the fact that this condition is experienced by the vast majority of these characters. Here, I cannot focus on all the examples in narrative and cinema that exist around the flaneurie aesthetics, but I will analyze some of them using different examples and trying to examine critically this notion of boredom and how the flaneur handles it, as I said before. But first of all, the idea of boredom, it's important to say that lies at the very origin of the term of the flaneur and is even inherent to this definition. The word is thought to derive from the Old Norse flana, defined as to run here and there, and the correspondent French verb flâner began to be used as a critical judgment, referring to the act of wasting time. The first dictionary to register it, in the sense of a nameless wanderer, is the Hotel in 1808, which defines flânerie as a vagabond activity and the grand flâneur as a great idler of unbearable laziness. That was the definition. And this explicitly frames flânerie as a kind of secular Acadia, a private vice with harmful consequences for public life at that moment. But with the term's appropriation by the bourgeois intellectual class, the discourse begins to suggest that this idleness may not only be non utilitarian, but even worthy of celebration. For example, Auguste Delacroix, a 19th century author and painter, claims that the flaneur represents the model of the modern philosopher, a protagonist who sees himself as intellectually and also attitudinally distinct from others due to his capacity to move at a self-determined pace and to observe urban life with careful attention. And this can also be read in Balzac, for example, in his Traité de la vie élégante. But in short, these discourses do not merely argue that the flaneur is not a loafer, but that anyone who sees him as such merely reveals their own ignorance, and his boredom thus no longer carries a negative connotation as in the past, but becomes a symbol of his genius. Even today, various authors defend the idea that urban strolling is a form of entertainment against boredom that ennobles its practitioner. This is exemplified in the autobiographical essay In Praise of Laziness by Guillermo Fadanelli, in which Fadanelli plays with the double meaning of the Spanish verb vagar, to wander, as both a whimsical mental activity and a capricious stroll, yet one imbued with literary value. Also, in The School of Boredom by Luigi Amara, he wanders through Las Vegas in an attempt to combat the specter of boredom, even going so far as to claim that God created the world out of sheer and simple boredom, of simple spleen. Well, let us now examine several examples of how boredom manifests in these narratives. In this first case, Nadia by André Breton, adopting an autobiographical tone, Breton recounts the erotic romantic encounters he allegedly shared with a mysterious vagabond woman, whom he nicknames Nadia. We don't know her real name. After meeting her by chance during one of his strolls around the Rue Lafayette. Specifically, it is through Nadia's mysterious influence that Breton gains access to what he will call later in the communicating vessels objective chance or something like that. Accidental events disconnected in time or in logic, which nevertheless seem not to be arbitrarily related, but rather prompted by a mysterious force, such as Breton encounter with Nadia, who appears as a ghost-like embodiment of desire, and simultaneously as a sort of enchantress who catalyzes ascetic moments during the brief span of their relationship. That's killing time and well, killing boredom. Yet in the novel, Breton shows that such projections, like dreams for Freud, is more or less the same idea, ultimately reveal not the fulfillment of desire, but rather its dissatisfaction, since their realization does not lead to happiness, but to more boredom and even to madness. Nadia temporarily displaces the boredom brought on by the mundane rhythm of everyday life, but she also leads a progressively frightened Breton to withdraw from her, and we can see this in this fragment. Do you see that window over there? She says, it's dark like all the others. Look closely. In a minute, it will light up and it will be red. A minute passes, the window lights up. Indeed, there are red curtains, and this leads Breton to run away from her. No, the trying to run away from boredom makes him feel frightened and even worse than at the beginning. Well, in this way, the urban woman personifies in this literature the boundary between the flaneurs' inner city, let's say, and the real city. This is also true for Louis Aragon's seminal novel, Le Paysan de Paris, Paris Peasant. In this sense, the flaneurs' wandering becomes a romantic hauntology through the city, but he himself also turns into a kind of bored and boring ghost, roaming through spaces he re-enchants with his poetic gaze while pursuing his ideal woman, the one who might allow him to escape from boredom in an effort to control another ghost, the spectre of Ennui, as he calls it. In this passage, the sight of desire, he becomes a fisherman, as he calls himself, of wind-born nymphs, thus entering a fully oniric and real setting through the idea, through the threshold, of boredom. Here is a fragment, as I said, in which I think we can find the idea and especially the effects of boredom for this particular flaneur. Like the previous one, the consequences of boredom are also surreal, but now in the shape of a dreamlike experience, of an oniric fantasy that goes beyond of the doors of perception. Well, from here, I would like to underline this part. This specter of is boredom, a young man of perfect beauty who yawns and strolls with a butterfly net, trying to catch goldfish. That would be the idea of boredom here. Well, in this previous text, we have seen not only that boredom leads to the construction of unreal scenarios in which, to some extent, the protagonist ultimately comes to believe, as if willingly entering an impossible universe he knows he has invented in order to escape his own tedium, but also that in many of these Western novels, the supposed cure for boredom often takes the form of an idealized and equally unattainable woman. And this pattern also appears beyond the European tradition. In Nevsky Prospect by Gogol portrays the central avenue of St. Petersburg as a vibrant stage where boredom is both challenged and deepened through the act of flânerie. The narrator describes the street as a phantasmagoria with constantly shifting figures, soldiers, clerks, aristocrats, whose movements enliven the urban scene. Two young men, the sensitive artist Piskarev and the more pragmatic Pirogov, embark on separate nighttime wanderings, each following an enticing female stranger seen on Nevsky, and their flânerie begins as a remedy for boredom. The street's glittery allure, enhanced by shop windows and gaslight, offers a seductive escape from tedium. However, this stroll also opens the door to deception once again. Piskarev's romantic chase ends in disillusionment when his beloved turns out to be a prostitute, shattering his fantasies and plunging him into despair. Ultimately, Gogol uses flânerie to reveal a paradox, I would say. The act of wandering relieves social monotony and boredom, yet the city's false glamour amplifies illusions and leads to emotional disillusionment. The narrator warns Nevsky prospect deceives at all hours, he says, especially at night, when its enchantment hides harsh truths. But undoubtedly, it is clear that boredom can lead to the extreme objectification of a woman, to pursue her in order to unveil her identity, even if this pursuit ultimately leads to despair and sorrow. We might assume that this consequence of boredom in urban narratives has faded over time, as it may seem as an excessively sexist trope, that has long been overcome, but this is not the case. It continues to record, albeit in more subtle forms, of course, in many artistic productions. I could offer numerous examples once again, but I have chosen to focus on one from a fairly recent, widely acclaimed, and popular film. The flaneur in Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris is also an artist, Jill Owen Wilson, a Hollywood screenwriter who longs for the creativity of the bohemian artist novelist, and his fiancée is portrayed as a wealthy and superficial woman, a boring woman. She shows no interest in the kind of art that sparks her husband's imagination, who is in turn also depicted as a boring man for her superficial friends. Gil retreats into his inner city once again through his poetic gaze, the nocturnal boulevards transform into an idealized 1920s Paris, a setting through which he attempts to overcome his boredom. And this city also acts as a threshold between dream and reality, as it only appears at the stroke of midnight. Although he relieves his boredom by conversing with figures from the past, particularly artists, he does so above all by establishing an emotional connection with a woman whom he elevates somehow to the status of a muse solely because she belongs to a bygone era. For this flaneur, the escape from boredom lies in an idealized and non existent past, symbolized by the female figure he cannot possess. Upon returning to the present, Gilles discovers his fiancée's infidelity without acknowledging his own with Marion Cotillard's character and chooses to remain in Paris with another woman, with Gabrielle, the antiques dealer, of whom he knows only, just only, that she loves all things and strolling along the Seine in the rain. She is therefore a mirror image of Gilles, who ultimately seeks a copy of himself somehow, someone who shares his vision of boredom and his imagined path to escape it. I will now turn to the conclusions, which in which I will try to offer a critical analysis of this concept of boredom that we have found in the flaneur's aesthetic. First of all, we can affirm that the spleen of the urban poet is not merely the result of his desire to overcome boredom and his inability to do so. Like Eros, he is driven by a lack, by the absence of an object of desire, and he may temporarily fill the void through signs or simulations of this unattainable object, but never truly satisfy it, as this very emptiness is what propels his flânerie at the same time, his artistic activity. Consequently, idleness ceases to be a source of pleasure and becomes instead a mere way of life, let's say, designed to soothe pain, one that never fully satisfies him and ultimately leads him into solipsism. Let us recall, for example, that Baudelaire in Spleen 2, in which he presents himself as the king of a rainy and boring Paris, a ruined kingdom incapable of fulfilling his desires. The melancholy and boredom thus emerge from dissatisfaction and it expresses the frustration of the romantic man who expects the city, and particularly women, to fulfill his desires. The city instead reveals itself as a desert ruled by the demon of boredom, where the flaneur becomes its most devoted subject. Once regarded as the site of authentic experiences, the city proves to be the factory of what Benjamin called always the same, immer schon dagewesenen, a space of capitalist reproduction disguised as novelty. Even Amara, that I mentioned before, recognized his hunger for increasingly baroque and intense impressions as an attempt to fill the void. Everything may become an artifice, even killing out of boredom can work for him. That's the flaneur's central problem, I would say, is his refusal to recognize boredom as a foundational cause of his identity. Instead, he splits his identity and transforms his self inflicted boredom into a demon that haunts him wherever he goes, until his wandering becomes a monotonous labor as well. Without realizing it, this increasingly grotesque demon of boredom is nothing but his own self portrait. So the privileged boredom, let's call it this way, that once generated creative leisure and gave birth to the flaneur, eventually becomes a destructive force, a kind of illness. It is therefore important to recognize that the flaneur's complaint against the capitalist city is not rooted in a sociopolitical critique, but even in an egoistic, individualistic mismanagement, I would say, of boredom. And well, that would be all. Thank you very much for your attention, for your time, and well, I would be more than happy to respond to any comment or suggestions you would like to add. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabel. It was super interesting. So after all, the problem of boredom in the flaneur is of an endogenous nature. Yeah,
Exactly.
the root of the problem of boredom is endogenous. Interesting. So, do you have any questions for Isabel? Okay, I have just one. It's a very short one. First of all, congratulations because the link between the aptitude or the figure of the flaneur and boredom, uh, according to my experience, has not been studied enough. The literature is really dispersed, so it's really difficult, and nobody dares to set explicitly that the problem is endogenous because because we don't want to. We prefer to blame the society always. Just the question. We are not used to see this figure of the flaneur represented by female characters in literature or art. Have you explored, have you researched on this question?
Mhm. Thank you very much for your question, and I think it's a very beautiful question. I would like to have more time to answer to it, but well, yeah, no, nowadays, some feminist literature is talking about the figure of the flaneuse. That would be the female version of the flaneur. But as when it comes to the topic of boredom, I would say that I have identified, I would like to do more research on this because as opposite to the figure of the masculine, let's say, flaneur, who experiences boredom, as you said, as an inherent part of his identity, I have found out that the flaneuse instead does not wander around the city out of boredom, but normally, as I have seen, for example, I don't know, the paradigm of this figure is Cleo from 5 to 7, for instance. Uh, the flaneuse is not bored, it's more like she's trying to find the sense of life or a way to escape from home, from the female obligations. Yeah, the idea of the gineceo, let's say, the idea of the female obligations that society imposes to her, even the idea of death sometimes. So it's not that much the idea of boredom per se. I would say that that would be the difference between these narratives.
Maybe she's trying to escape domestic boredom.
That would be a good point, actually. Domestic boredom, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
okay. Annie said, I was reminded of the definition of boredom as desire for desires, or by Tolstoy. In this case, quite literally, romantic or sexual desire.
Totally, totally. That could be the best summary of all of it.
Yeah, but
Yes.
I absolutely see a research line between that of the figure of flaneur and chronic boredom. Yeah.
Thank you. That's
Mhm.
encouraging because, I have to search another path of research right now. So if you think that's a good point, I will try to follow it.
Chronic boredom, I mean, from a pure clinical point of view.
Mhm. Mhm.
Great. Any other comments, questions? Are you hungry? Hungry?
I guess so.